Okay, we'll start. I'm Alan Winters. I'm Director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory, and I'll be chairing this afternoon's meeting. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for coming along. Just to reiterate, we will be recording this event. If you want to remain anonymous, you can sign in under a different name. But we will be releasing a recording in a few days' time. The event's timed to last for an hour. We've got 3 people who will be speaking, each for 10 minutes, and then we have about half an hour for questions and answers, which I will be chairing. For the questions and answers, we'd like to use the Q&A facility in Zoom. So if you could type in your question, I will try and collect them up and direct the traffic. If it is directed to one specific speaker, you can mention that, but otherwise I will sort of direct it where it seems best. I think everybody will be able to see the questions, so they're in sort of the public domain. While we're going on, please will you keep your microphones muted. We're not planning to have questions asked live, but rather through the question and answer facility. So I'd be grateful if you'd keep yourselves muted throughout. There is a chat function as well for sort of technical issues and so on, but questions through the Q&A session, please. I think that's all the housekeeping. I don't have to tell you where the toilets are or the fire escape, so that's a blessing of webinars. So let me get on and introduce the event. The title is UK-EU Free Trade Agreement. Please, sir, I want some more. I hope it will become plain why it is called that. 3 speakers, 2 from the UK Trade Policy Observatory. Peter Holmes, who is a reader in economics in the University of Sussex and a fellow of the Observatory. Julia Magntorn Garrett, who is a research officer in the UK Trade Policy Observatory, also in the University of Sussex. And then acting as a discussant to get the conversation going, Sam Lowe, who's a senior research fellow in the Centre for European Reform. I think that's all I need to say by way of introduction, so I'm going to hand over to Peter now. Peter.
Okay, hello. I'm now going to try and share my screen. And I don't know if anybody can hear. Alan is on there. The screen. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Lovely. We call this because we think that this is an analysis of the UK's the draft free trade agreement, certain aspects of it, and our view is it is, in the words of Sam in a previous conversation we had together, ambitious. This is the briefing paper that it's based on, and the link is there. We're going to divide the talk into the presentation by myself and Julia into 2 parts. I'll be talking about goods trade, and Julia will be talking about the services side, and then Sam, who it's a delight to be with again, will make some comments on it. I've just got basically 4 points to make that it's so striking that the government, having committed to the level playing field concept in the political declaration, has now moved such a long way away from it, and yet the market access demands which the UK is making are really rather strong on rules of origin and mutual recognition of testing and certification, which we'll talk about in some detail. But on the other side, it leaves out completely anything beyond WTO status in state aids and public procurement, something of great importance to the Commission. So let's just start off with the point which is sort of in the headlines, the notion of the level playing field, which I think economists sometimes don't like because of its connotations of fairness rather than efficiency, has always been at the center of the EU's idea of free trade. That if you have a degree of harmonization of all rules and regulations that could distort trade, harmonization or mutual recognition, there's no possibility of unfairness, and therefore you don't need to have precautionary barriers, contingent protection and so on, because nothing is made or allowed to get into free circulation inside the single market which gives its producers an unfair advantage. And if anybody breaks these rules, the CJEU can ensure compliance. Mrs. May talked about having a common rule book, and the October 2019 political declaration continued the commitment to this concept of level playing field. It was spelled out in quite some detail, and the EU's own draft free trade agreement more or less uses the same words that was in the political declaration as signed by the UK. But the UK draft free trade agreement that came out, I think in May, wasn't it, has a complete rejection of the concept of harmonization of rules, but seeks to maximize market access. The first point, which is rather surprising, is the, I know Sam will love to correct me if I've gotten this wrong, the rules of origin issue. The UK has basically asked the EU to extend to us a free trade agreement in which duty-free access is granted not only to goods originating in Britain, which any free trade agreement must do, and goods which were parts and components from the EU incorporated into British goods. That's the normal thing in a free trade agreement, bilateral accumulation. But the UK is asking that the EU should count, for the purposes of giving UK origin to exports, any parts and components, any inputs which come from countries which both the UK and the EU have free trade agreements with. Now, this is something which the EU is moving towards, but it has always insisted that not only should both partners have free trade agreements with the relevant third country, they should all have harmonized rules of origin. The UK is asking for any set of rules of origin that the UK might have to be, well, they're asking that these be regarded as equivalent. And this is where the headline on our publicity comes from, that the UK is asking for goods made in Japan to be treated as made in Britain. I mean, what we're saying is that parts and components from Korea and Japan should be treated by the EU as if they were made in Britain. Because in industry like the car industry, it's very, very rare that any product produced in Britain is actually more than 45% or so British value added. Whereas the rules of origin in cars normally are requiring 55% local origin. And of course, in NAFTA, or USMCA, this is one of the very extreme things. And of course, any free trade agreement we have with the US is a bit unlikely to treat British cars as if they were British cars, because of the unlikelihood that there'll be 65% UK origin in them. So in effect, what Britain is asking for is the benefits of a customs union, which is what it rejected. In a customs union, as opposed to a free trade agreement, anything which has come in from a third country is then in free circulation and doesn't have internal customs barriers. Now, that's actually quite a strong ask, but I think that probably the most remarkable request the UK is making is the idea that there should be mutual recognition of testing and certification without any kind of harmonization of underlying standards. Now, the thing about standards and regulations, which is the crucial point, is that the standard harmonization of rules and regulations doesn't automatically guarantee your access into a partner country's territory unless there is an agreement on how those standards and regulations are assessed. That's what conformity assessment is. And the UK is basically asking that even where we have different standards and regulations, and it is insistent in the text that the mutual recognition of conformity assessment should not be accompanied by harmonization of standards, except really in the case of cars. The mutual recognition of conformity assessment means that even where our standards are different, if a British inspector or a British registered inspector issues a certificate to a product which says and says that this is made in conformity to EU standards, the EU should recognize that certificate. There'll have to be a border check of the paperwork, but there should be no need for physical inspection because a British testing agency has confirmed that the product is in conformity with EU standards. Strictly speaking, the UK has asked for this for TBT measures, but not for SPS measures, but there it sought the EU's agreement on procedure for the recognition of equivalence. So what the UK is doing is asking for the right to diverge on standards, but then the right to sell anything which is marked as being made in conformity with EU standards, even though these are not compulsory in the UK, to be allowed free access into the EU. Now, so they want the right to diverge on regulations, but for the EU to accept conformity assessment procedures. Now, the EU has never accepted this, and various discussions I've had with people in Brussels over the last few years have made it clear that their view is that this is not something they can accept. No previous EU free trade agreement has allowed this, except for the European Economic Area, where there is binding compulsory regulatory alignment, and in certain very specific areas, particularly cars, in the Japan and Korea agreements. But there, Japan and Korea have agreed to bind themselves to the to the EU, well, strictly speaking, the UN car standards, which the UK has sort of grudgingly said it's going to do. But hasn't committed itself to do it permanently. There are a number of self-standing and also as part of free trade agreement, mutual recognition of conformity assessment agreements, but generally they don't have blanket recognition of conformity assessment procedures. They normally just spell out a procedure for mutual recognition of conformity assessment. I mean, strictly speaking, the UK one has certain sectors in which this applies, but it appears to ask for complete rollover of this mutual recognition of conformity assessment, even at the end of the transition period. So this is actually quite a significant ask. So the UK is asking for two rather strong things, but it has made it very explicit that it doesn't want to have any kind of comprehensive agreement in two areas where the EU is very keen that there should be commitments made. On state aids or subsidies and public procurement, the UK draft agreement just states that the parties will reaffirm their WTO commitments. subsidies code and the GPA. The UK is, so the EU is currently bringing new instruments in to deal with unfair subsidies for third parties, and it's a bit unlikely that we'll be exempt from those. And it is worth observing. I tweeted about I retweeted some of the comments that people like Julian Morm are making about some rather, shall we say, controversial public procurement arrangements that the UK is currently making in COVID area. And somebody then said Joe Morm would not be able to publicize these without the EU transparency procedures on public procurement being in place. And this was commented on by Lucien Chernat, who I believe is going to be the EU's next negotiator on public procurement. So I think public procurement is as delicate as state aids here. But Barnier has been very, very explicit for some time that they're going to be restrictive on rules of origin. They don't want the UK to be an assembly plant for car sales and other items going into Europe. And he's been very explicit, again, about not giving the UK the right to use British conformity assessment procedures to assess compatibility with EU standards. And he's actually made the point that not only is it an issue of the trade in goods, it's also a matter of trade in services, in the sense that he doesn't want the UK conformity assessment industry to get access to the whole EU market. And of course, it goes back a long way that the EU has said it wants an agreement on subsidies.
Peter,
so
if you could wrap up,
yes.
please.
Yep, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Peter. And you've released the screen. So I'm going to turn now to Julia Magntorn Garrett, who's going to talk about trading services. Julia.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Peter. Yes, so I will talk a little bit about the UK's draft when it comes to services trade. And I've also got 4 sort of areas that I will cover. So in broad terms, overall, the UK and the EU drafts are pretty similar when it comes to the sort of broad structure of the services chapters. They both include this kind of standard provisions for service liberalisation, market access, and national treatment, which essentially prohibit discrimination and quantitative restrictions for services suppliers of the other party. On investment, they both propose to include provisions that prohibit performance requirements and nationality requirements for senior managers. All of those things are sort of standard in EU's trade agreements. In fact, quite a lot of the text in the UK's draft is sort of almost a copy paste from EU's previous agreements with the likes of Canada, for example. So agreeing on the kind of broad structure of the services chapters seems pretty uncontroversial. Where it gets tricky, as with most things in trade negotiations, is in the details. So services, accompanying the services chapters will be annexes spelling out all the detailed restrictions and reservations that the UK and the EU wants to make on a sectoral basis. And negotiations over those restrictions can be long, although we don't have that much time, and complicated, especially negotiating with the EU, because a lot of the relevant regulations belong to national governments rather than EU bodies, and even within national governments to independent regulatory bodies. So there's lots of parties involved and negotiations quickly become complicated. And until we know the contents of those annexes that will go alongside the chapters, we can't really say for sure how far the agreement will go in terms of avoiding new barriers to services trade between the UK and the EU. But one area in terms of sectoral coverage that we already know that the drafts diverge on is on audiovisual services. That was pretty expected. The EU always carves out audiovisual services from its trade agreements, whereas for the UK, this is an area where the UK has a commercial interest. It has the largest audiovisual sector in Europe, and it has indeed included audiovisual services in its draft. It has, in fact, a dedicated chapter, although it's pretty short, but it's still there, on audiovisual services. So this is an area where the two sides are pretty far apart. Another area which was sort of expected also to be tricky is financial services. In terms of what FTAs do to facilitate cross-border trading financial services, they tend to cover only a very limited range of activities. So that's really not a viable option for the UK to rely on in terms of continue to trade on a cross-border basis. Instead, what cross-border trade would rely on is equivalence, and that's a process that has been sort of talked about a lot. The process of equivalence decisions is a separate one from the FTA talks. It's been going on. In fact, the aim was that the assessment of equivalence decisions was to be completed by the end of June. That hasn't happened. The issue with equivalence compared to the sort of passporting regime that the UK currently uses is that equivalence status can be revoked at very short notice. So it's much more unstable than the passporting regime. And it also doesn't cover all activities in the financial services sector. So things like commercial bank lending and deposit taking is not covered. So even though this is a separate process from the FTA talks, the UK's draft still hints to this process. So Article 1719 of the UK's drafts says that there should be transparency and appropriate consultation in the process of adoption, suspension, and withdrawal of equivalence decisions. So that sounds very much as the UK asking for equivalence decisions not to be unilateral as they are now, but rather a more joint process. At least that seems to be how the EU has taken it, because Barnier has subsequently come out and said that the EU will not agree to any co-management of equivalence decisions, and rather that they want to keep this as a unilateral process of granting and revoking equivalence. The next topic I want to just touch on is mutual recognition of professional qualifications. This is another area where the UK and the EU's drafts differ. In terms of what the UK in terms of what is usually in the EU's agreements on this, the EU, the agreements that the EU have tend to sort of set up a framework for agreeing mutual recognition agreements in the future, and sort of set up a committee that will oversee that process. But in terms of substance, these FTAs, they tend to not achieve very much on substance. For example, to my knowledge, the agreement that EU has with Canada, CETA, which came into force in 2016, has this sort of mutual recognition framework, but it hasn't achieved anything, any actual mutual recognition agreements in practice yet. So whereas the EU's draft very much reflects the kind of practice that EU usually has in its FTAs, the UK draft goes much further. So the UK's proposal would see recognition of professional qualifications as the default option, except sometimes subject to an aptitude test. And the only exception would be where there are substantial differences between the parties and an aptitude test wouldn't be possible. But that would be a very big step forward in terms of setting up a process that could actually work in terms of being effective in achieving mutual recognition agreement. And it would be much more close to the sort of system that is in place within the single market. But with that then comes skepticism from the EU in the sense of worries that the UK is trying to cherry pick the good parts of the single market without wanting to sign up to the obligations that come with it. So this hasn't been met with open arms from the EU in any sense. And then the final area I wanted to talk about is temporary movement of professionals, or mode 4 trade. This is an area which, where the UK tends to be pretty restrictive in terms of the commitment it has made in EU's previous FTAs. It certainly tends to be more restrictive than most other EU member states. So it's perhaps a little bit surprising then that the UK's draft actually goes further, both further than the UK's typical offer on mode 4, but also in some places further than what the EU typically offers in this area. So for example, the UK has suggested that intra-corporate transferees should be able to stay for up to 5 years in the other party, whereas the EU's typical offer is 3 years. The UK has also gone further than what it typically does, in the sense that it has included some categories of workers which it usually opts out from. So investors and short-term business visitors have been included in the UK's draft. These categories are usually included in the EU's FTAs, but the UK usually opts out from them, so it doesn't make any commitments for those categories. But in its draft, it has explicitly included them. Interestingly, actually, EU's draft doesn't mention investors, even though EU's FTAs tend to have this this category included. I will say, similar to what I said before, though, that this all hinges on what will be in the sort of detailed annexes that will be accompanying this chapter, where again the parties can make exceptions and limitations. So until we know what's in the annexes, we don't know for sure exactly what the UK commitments will be. And a final point to make is that the EU's draft includes provisions for sort of wider mobility issues, like visa-free travel for short-term stays, or facilitating stays for researchers and youth exchanges and so on, which the UK's draft doesn't touch on. So just to wrap up then what me and also Peter have been saying, I think, so the UK government's rhetoric is very much that the UK is seeking an agreement similar to the EU's agreements with countries like Japan and Canada, and therefore that agreeing such an agreement shouldn't be difficult, because the EU has already sort of agreed that with other countries. But when you actually look at the UK's draft, that's not really aligned with reality. The UK's draft goes further than previous EU FTAs in a number of areas that we haven't touched on. And that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing that the UK is ambitious. In fact, it probably should be ambitious, given how important a trading partner the EU is to the UK. And a lot of the suggestions that the UK has made have some merit from a British perspective. But it does sort of raise a slight contradiction, in the sense that on the one hand, the UK has tabled these very ambitious and sometimes innovative asks, while at the same time severely limiting the time for negotiations by refusing to extend the transition period. And so there's only so much that can be achieved in the little time that we have left, which then begs the question of why the UK is doing it, what the sort of strategy behind it is. But I will stop there, and I will hand over to Sam.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia. Let's pass on to Sam. One person has said their name is not attached to their question, but in fact I'm seeing names on the questions I'm getting. So don't worry, you are not totally anonymous. So, Sam.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to discuss this paper. Firstly, I should say I agree with the premise that there are some clear examples where the UK is asking more of the EU than what the EU normally offers in its free trade agreement, and this in essence undermines the UK narrative that we only want what the EU has given others. However, I should qualify slightly in that whilst I agree that some of these asks are ambitious, to my mind they're not the areas that have been discussed are not going to be the things that scupper a trade agreement. I think if whether there's a trade agreement or not depends on whether a political compromise can be found on the headline issues of fish, level playing field, which does touch on Peter's points, the role of Court of Justice and structure of the agreement. If a political agreement and compromise can be reached in those areas, then I do think a deal can be found, and actually even in some of these particular issues, the EU does have some scope for compromise. On one of them where I don't think the EU will compromise is on rules of origin. I do agree with Peter. I do not see them agreeing to the UK's request for third-party content from mutual trade agreement partners to count as being either from the UK or the EU for the purpose of qualifying for tariff-free trade. And the reason for that is that, A, if the UK wants that, at least with the regional agreements, there's already an option on the table, which is the Pan-Euromed Convention on Rules of Origin. That doesn't help with Japan and the like, but it helps with, say, Turkey, Morocco, Israel, and the North African Association agreements. But and the other reason is just it's difficult to see what's in it for the EU. The consequence of them not agreeing to this request is there's a greater incentive for manufacturing to move to within the EU territory out of the UK, which provides political wins, even if you can argue that there's lost efficiency. But one issue I do want to pick up on slightly, where I do actually disagree with Peter slightly, is on mutual recognition of conformity assessment. This is an area in which I think the EU could actually accept some of the UK requests, or to put it another way, there's no technical reason why they couldn't, and there is quite a lot of precedent for the UK granting, the EU granting such provisions with third countries. Peter mentioned some of them, but if you look at, say, Israel, Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada, and some others, you can find a sort of smorgasbord of all of the provisions the UK has asked for. And I think we also just need to be clear about what these provisions the UK is asking for do and how it operates in practice. Currently, if you're producing a product to an EU standard within the UK, as an EU member, for the most part, you self-certify that product. For riskier products, you require third-party certification. This is when you get a testing body to certify that the product you produced meets the relevant standards. And then as a British producer, you place it on the European market and it's in free circulation. And if there are any issues, the market enforcement is done by national bodies or the Commission. And the point I would make is this is also how it applies for imports from third countries to a point. If you are importing from a third country, say China, the producer in China will produce to the European standard. However, the liability for placing it on the market lies with the importer. So you want to be sure that the Chinese producer has actually produced to the standard, and you also hold the file and you accept the liability for placing it on the market. This isn't a checks at the border issue. This is a what is allowed on the market and what isn't issue. And the point I would make here is that post-Brexit, British producers will still be able to produce to EU standards anyway. And in the event that they're self-certifying the products, they will still be able to do that. However, the liability for placing it on the market will shift to the EU-based importer. What the UK is asking for here is, in the event of products that require third-party certification, they're asking that UK testing bodies continue to be allowed to provide that certification. And I just don't think this is as big an issue as Peter suggests, in that the EU has this in place with Australia to a degree. It's also offering it to the US as part of its proposal to end the trade war. So, and we're not talking, the US isn't going to harmonise to EU standards. It's just about whether a testing body located outside of the EU territory can certify that a product has been produced to an EU standard. And I don't think it's the same as single market access, in that if we were to take medicines as an example, what the UK is asking for is for mutual recognition of conformity assessment covering good manufacturing practice. So this is certifying that UK-based labs meet EU standards, but also for batch certification. But in terms of batch release, that will still have to be enacted by a person based within the EU territory who takes on the liability. In the case of chemicals, the authorization will still have to be held by a person based in the EU territory. The liability is still shifted, and this also comes with loads of issues around labelling. You have to switch the labels on all the products. So what the UK is asking for is ambitious, but it's not entirely unprecedented. And actually the EU arguments for rejecting this to date haven't been really about, well, there's no precedent for this, we can't do it. It's just about the fact that they're worried about having so much of the testing industry offshore. They want to bring the testing industry onshore because it comes with jobs, and they're worried that not enough manufacturing will move. But I think that when you take into account, say, COVID-19 and the need for resilient supply chains, there's a clear EU interest to agreeing to some of this request, if not all of it. In other areas, so if we think about mutual recognition of professional qualifications, yes, the UK's ask is really quite ambitious in that it would actually work. the current EU model for mutual recognition of professional qualifications, as enacted in its trade agreements with Canada and Japan, doesn't work in practice. It creates a framework for dialogue between the relevant certification bodies, and it's been very unsuccessful. I think they've been close to getting architects recognising between Canada and the EU for a while, but it's still not over the line. The UK-based proposal goes halfway towards single market access, I would say, in that there is an assumed recognition of UK-based qualifications subject to an aptitude test if a UK-based engineer applies for their qualification to be recognised in, say, Austria. But one of the big differences is that temporary recognition of qualifications would no longer apply, so that would curtail temporary cross-border provision, and also fly-in, fly-out trade. I'd hope the EU could move here. I've suggested the UK asked this of the EU in the past, but there is a big issue here, which is that mutual recognition of professional qualifications is difficult for the EU to negotiate with third countries, in that it is not a sole EU competence. It's not even really a member state competence. Often the ability to grant qualifications has been outsourced to private bodies within member states, and these private bodies can be quite protectionist. Why would they want to recognise a qualification granted by another private body if it means that people won't still continue to pay them to do it? So there is some difficulty there, but potentially there could be some movement over time, if not within the next 6 months. However, going back to, I'll close here, coming back to, I think, the overarching point, the UK is making some ambitious asks of the EU. We should acknowledge that. I think it's okay to make ambitious asks. However, I think the real determining factor over whether a deal can be reached or not is not the result of the negotiations on these fairly technical issues. It remains the major headline issues as to can we find a way through on level playing field? Can we find a way through on fish? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Sam. I've got a few questions which I will group. I guess we'll start perhaps with sort of the slightly narrower ones, and I do in the end want to end up with so what? I mean, does this crash it, or Sam has given us one answer, but Peter, Julia might have a different one. So the first of the questions really is about the conformity assessment, and I direct it to Peter, but I guess also Sam, about whether or not the EU is overdoing its resistance, that it has had conformity assessment agreements in sort of relatively non-sensitive areas with other countries. Laurent Bartel, whose questions is mentioned Japanese wine, was it? Oh, I can't remember but we have seen it. And also a suggestion that, in fact, there's a simple solution, which is that UK labs do the work, but they are essentially sort of certified by EU certifiers of certifiers. So I don't know if you want to react to that, Peter, that in a sense it's a bit of a storm in a teacup.
Well, I think there are two questions. One is, why is the EU doing it? And secondly, could they be persuaded to roll back on it? I mean, I think I would, I mean, Sam is obviously right that we're oversimplifying by saying that EU can't allow mutual recognition of testing certification. But I would say that the agreements which the EU has had in the past go way beyond what the UK is asking for. So they set up a procedure for mutual recognition of testing certification. And if you look at the background, so you'll find that only 1 or 2 bodies are actually certified. So the EU-US agreement, I think signed in the 90s, had 9 sectors where they were going to allow mutual recognition of testing certification. And by 10 years later, only 2 of them had actually agreed to accredit the testing certification bodies. So I think it's perfect. One could say it's possible for the EU to make this change, but and again, one could say that if the EU was only concerned about the safety of its consumers, maybe it just ought to go ahead with it. But it hasn't, and quite clearly, again, as Sam says, this doesn't apply where there is CE certification. But I think there is also this potential issue that if we're going to deregulate and change our rules, one of the ways in which lightening red tape is going to happen is actually relaxing the quality assurance procedures. So I think in principle, Sam and Laurent must be right that if the EU was really determined to do this, it would not have to sacrifice its product quality to consumers, or that the risks are not as great as they sometimes say. But they have been quite strict on this over the years. So I'm not convinced that it is a very easy thing to sort out. And I see someone asked about Northern Ireland, and my understanding is that there's some very complicated things going on there, that the Northern Irish testing and certification procedures will be sort of recognised in the rest of the UK, but not necessarily in Ireland. And there's nothing to stop you having AFNOR from France or TUV from Germany coming in and certifying your products and then sending them across to Europe. But I think Barnier, he's got these two reasons. First, protecting the integrity of the internal market, which is a bit symbolic, but gone on for a long time. But also, as we've been saying, it's the testing and certification industry, which is an interest in its own right.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sam.
So just to add to that, I agree this is something that the EU is being particularly difficult about in this specific circumstance. And you can make the argument that along with other areas where the EU is asking more of the UK than it normally does, it's due to proximity and size. However, I just want to reiterate the point that when it comes to the enforcement of product standards, it's largely done in market. And if you want to if you're a producer or a seller placing a product on the EU market, you are responsible for ensuring that it meets the European standards, so that if it required third-party testing, it's been carried out, that you hold the file that comes with or you hold the file that comes with the self-assessment for CE marking. And because of that, there is no danger to the EU consumer of allowing UK-based third-party testing bodies to continue to perform that function, assuming that there would be some sort of supervisory function sitting above that to ensure that they do actually continue to do that testing in a way that's compatible with the EU approach. So I just don't think this is a technical issue. I don't think there is quite a lot of precedent to suggest it's possible. And when you look at the EU's offer to the US to resolve the trade war, we're not talking about a country that it trusts very much at the moment. We're not talking about a country that has an even equivalent approach to standard setting. The US approach is a mess. It's trying to export it everywhere else, but it's just not very good, in my opinion. The EU approach is better. But the EU's comfortable talking about it in that context. So I just don't think there is a technical reason why it couldn't do so with the UK. And I don't think it causes any risk to the EU consumer. The only issue is about whether it creates fewer incentives for the relocation of manufacturing and also the testing industry, which is more of just a general trade concern rather than anything more than that.
Okay, thanks very much, Sam. Had a couple of questions mentioned Northern Ireland or other parts of the United Kingdom than England. Let me perhaps ask if Julia wants to comment about rules of origin in Northern Ireland. What role do rules of origin play with the Northern Irish protocol?
Yeah, I feel slightly scared talking about rules of origin in front of people that know this better. But yes, I think, it will be complicated. The Northern Ireland Protocol means that it sort of introduces almost the sort of prospect of not just rules of origin in terms of what foreign sort of material is used in products that come into the UK, but then there is this sort of GB Northern Ireland, there's almost domestic rules of origin as well that will be required. The issue is that if the UK has a trade agreement with a country that the EU doesn't, that country could send their products into GB at lower tariffs. And if there wasn't any checks on sort of those products, they could be sent on to Northern Ireland without any further checks. So clearly it will be complicated. But I think I will defer the technical to maybe Sam, that holds his hand up, to answer it better.
Sam, do you want to comment briefly on that?
Well, so on rules of origin for inward bound trade into the UK, so GB and Northern Ireland, I'm not sure how big an issue it necessarily is in the event that the UK has a trade agreement with a country that the EU doesn't. So to give an example, if if you import a good from the US into GB under the terms of the UK's trade agreement with the US, you can claim the lower tariff. However, if it then gets moved on to Northern Ireland, there's still going to be controls under the Northern Ireland Protocol on goods entering Northern Ireland from GB, and it could be then subject to the EU's external tariff unless it meets the rules of origin criteria of the future UK-EU free trade agreement. For goods from the US entering Northern Ireland, assuming Northern Ireland is covered by the UK's trade agreement with the US, which is the UK's intention, then those goods would qualify for tariff-free trade from the US, so long as you can demonstrate that A, it meets the rules of origin criteria of the trade agreement with the US, and B, that the product is going to remain in Northern Ireland. So you end up with a two-step process. And having done that, you've identified yourselves to the authorities to quite a large extent. So if there is onward travel afterwards, they can probably catch up with you quite quickly. More generally, the rules of origin problem for Northern Ireland is I think it has not been well understood that Northern Ireland will no longer be part of the EU's customs territory vis-a-vis third countries, in that inputs from Northern Ireland will no longer count as originating for EU free trade agreements, because Northern Ireland will be part of the UK's customs territory in theory, if not in practice.
Okay, thanks very much. Sheila Page asked a question in the news from the FT this morning, but in the news a long time ago in UKTPO, about the SPS regulations. Any quick reflections on the fact that quite a number of these belong to the devolved administrations, and it seems that rather than talking to them, the English government, the Westminster government, is just going to tell them what to do. But is that fair? Sam?
I don't want to hog it, but I can speak to this because this is something I wrote about in 2017. One of the sort of strange truths of EU membership is that it was actually quite conducive to devolution in the UK, in that it allowed for a single market framework to be created that wasn't imposed on the other nations of the UK by Westminster, and it allowed for divergence, but not to the point of market distortion. We now hit a point where that single market of the UK has to be created in Westminster by the government, and there are certain issues where this could prove slightly controversial. So within the EU framework, there were regional carve-outs on authorisations for GM, and Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales opted out of certain GM approaches, whilst England remained opted in. And so there is a fear from the devolves that if over the course of the next few years, the UK changes its approach on those issues, it will then be imposed on the other regions of the other nations of the UK. They at least, even if the production remains banned, they will have to accept products. And this then feeds into the context of trade agreements. Of course, from a DIT perspective, they don't want to have any constraints placed on them by the nations of the UK. They want to have the ability to just negotiate everything as freely as possible, and they would hope it would apply UK-wide. There's lots of examples of countries that negotiate externally whilst having problems with their own internal single market. You can even think of Canada, but then at the extreme, in the middle, you've got the US on services, and then you've also got India. So it's possible to negotiate externally whilst having differences within your internal market. And actually, the UK will have that anyway, because Northern Ireland will be bound to EU rules. But yes, if there is the possibility of divergence between the different nations, it makes it more difficult for the UK to negotiate externally, which might make it more difficult to sign free trade agreements, which means that Westminster wants to impose a single framework over the whole UK, and this has led to Scotland being upset.
I mean, it is true that people are suspicious of agreements with the US because there is so many issues where the federal government essentially washes its hands and says, no, it's state responsibility, don't blame us, even though that is not exactly kosher within the WTO. we had a question from Marco about financial services. We talked about sort of parallels in CETA on financial services. Is there any useful parallel that can be drawn with EU-Japan? Is that something that we know anything about? EU-Korea certainly has financial service regulations which were actually fairly liberal, but certainly so far as the recognition of new products are concerned. Sam, you're waiting.
I think Julia was unmuted.
No, Sam, go ahead. If you know EU-Japan better than me.
No, please go.
No, I have something to say afterwards. So you go first.
Okay. So EU-Japan does include a chapter on regulatory cooperation. It largely just creates a framework for future discussion between regulators, which of course I think is something that regulators can make of what they want. I have certain, I sometimes wonder if the right place to situate these things is in with free trade agreements. And I think it's interesting that between the UK and Switzerland, there is now a new regulatory dialogue looking for possibilities for mutual recognition, but it's been run out of the Treasury. It's not been run out of DIT. And I just wonder if there's just competence issues and issues about getting the right people in the room, but it's there. In terms of market access, no. EU free trade agreements do very little more than lock in existing levels of openness, which it has its use because it means you can be sure that it's not going to roll back. And we should also just be clear that free trade agreements don't touch on regulatory issues for the most part. They don't touch on issues to do with licensing. It's all to do with market access, which is useful when it comes to, say, what we call mode 3, the ability to incorporate within a third country, and that it might remove provisions requiring certain board members to be of a given nationality or the like. But in terms of cross-border trade, it's about removing bans on the being able to do it, or on the quantity of transactions, or putting price thresholds. But that's not where the barriers largely are. It's largely regulatory, and that's something that EU-Japan doesn't deal with, and could be dealt with by the unilateral equivalence process, which, as Julia mentioned, is technically not part of the free trade agreement discussion between the UK and the EU, but politically, of course, they're linked.
Julia.
And just to sort of, on the sort of idea of getting CETA plus commitments, I think this is not limited to financial services. This is something for the whole sort of services area, is that both CETA and also EU-Japan include these most favoured nation clauses, which essentially are there to make sure that the commitments in those agreements are not eroded if, say, the EU were to grant better treatment to another country in the future, in which case that better treatment would have to be extended. So that is just another sort of reason why in services, even though, as Sam said, services, FTAs on services don't tend to actually bring much liberalisation. It's more about locking in applied policies. But these MFN clauses also means that achieving sort of CETA plus or EU-Japan plus provisions will be tricky.
Okay, thank you very much, Julia. I've got a little group of questions, which I think I'll make the last questions. In a sense, it's the bottom line. What does it all add up to? I mean, Martin Wolf says, well, so what are the odds on an agreement? And please do make estimates if you want, and if I think they're favourable, I might take you up on them. But also a suggestion, is it actually just going to be goods only at the last moment, or is it going to be a crash at the last moment followed by all sorts of stuff under the table or side separate deals, just longer than the 6 months that were being talked about so far? And then I guess part of this also, I mean, with the rules of origin thing, is the correct strategy for the UK just to accept the PEM? Or is this something that the UK, in a sense, has a strong interest in pursuing right to the end, given that we fairly much agree it's going to be difficult for or it's unlikely that the EU will agree? So let me sort of throw those out and sort of, I guess, sort of turn these into final statements, if you like. So why don't we go in the same order as we spoke? So Peter, do you want to comment on those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm the last person to be able to predict what the British government's going to do. I mean, I think, and Sam and I have discussed this in a podcast a little while ago, I think I'd still just about cling to the idea that the British government will be able to agree something which incorporates an implementation period. They've been so, the May government was so insistent that what we were going to have was an implementation period with nothing to implement. The Johnson government has always talked about transition, and I'm not aware of them having said that they would refuse any implementation periods. I think that is something which we could conceivably hope for, in which some things are left, the status quo might be allowed to continue until they're sorted out, though clearly this is quite complicated from a legal point of view within the EU. And as for on the rules of origin thing, I think the obvious thing you have to ask, well, why didn't the UK offer PEMS to sound a bit conciliatory? I suppose the answer must be that so much of our inward investment is from Korea and Japan, which are not covered by that agreement, and that it's an important thing for the UK to get those parts and components eligible for duty-free access. But in terms of predicting what the British government's going to do, I really will mute myself.
Okay, Julia.
Yeah, I mean, I also don't want to put a number on the probability of a deal, but I also think that there probably will be a deal at the end of this, and I agree with what Peter said, that maybe, you know, it's just a matter of getting something over the line and then having an implementation period where more time is given to work out some of these tricky areas. In terms of a goods only agreement, I think from a British perspective, I'm not sure that would make so much sense, in the sense that services trade is clearly an area where Britain is really competitive, and it's an important area, perhaps more for Britain than for the EU. So doing an agreement on goods only might make it more difficult to then, the EU doesn't really have the incentive perhaps to do much on services later on. So I think it makes sense to negotiate it all in one go in that sense.
Sam.
So I'm fairly optimistic in that I do think that an agreement will be reached. I don't think it will be reached until the end of the summer. I still think we have a bit more drama to go, and I still think that the negotiators have reached the edge of their technical ability to find a way through without further political intervention. But I think, assuming there will be further political intervention later in the year on all the contentious issues, you can see a way through. On fish, the UK wants to negotiate every 1 year, the EU wants to negotiate, never negotiate again. Surely there's a middle ground, 5 years, 10 years, 7 years, or the like. On level playing field, I think the UK will have to compromise and accept that its commitments will need to be enforceable, but then I think the focus will shift away from dynamic alignment and state aid and focus more heavily on non-regression. So largely in the ballpark of what's being proposed on labour and environment. And that's something hopefully the UK can live with. On the enforcement side, it's going to have to agree that with the US anyway. So we already, in a sense, know it's going to have to concede the point there. And then in terms of structure and role of ECJ, I think the way you minimise the role of the ECJ is you ensure that as fewer disputes as possible will ever be on the question of interpretation of EU law. And at that point, the dispute functions works as a normal state-to-state process would, and doesn't need to bring in the ECJ. So yes, I think there'll be a compromise. I don't think it will be a goods-only agreement, because I think once that political agreement has been reached, there's no technical reason trade agreements need to take a very long time. Under the May government, a customs union was negotiated in about a week. The Northern Ireland backstop in about a night. Once the political will is there, you can do it quickly, and the way it will be done quickly is that lots of the provisions will just be copied and pasted from existing EU free trade agreements. And I'd expect nearly the entire services schedules, perhaps with some tweaks on temporary movement of people, mutual recognition of professional qualifications, will look near identical to the EU 27 schedules on Japan. So I expect a comprehensive agreement, but then I get to Peter's point. Implementing all of this overnight on day one will be incredibly disruptive for British business. So I do hope they find some way of introducing a supplementary implementation period to allow for time to adapt.
Okay, thank you very much. We have come to the end of the hour, so I guess I do need to wrap it up. There are a few questions outstanding, for which I apologise, but the panel will see them. They may be able to respond bilaterally. There you have it. There is going to be an agreement. The British government is doing something not completely outrageous by asking for quite a lot, but we shouldn't be betting that they're going to get all of that. So thank you everyone for coming along. Please do keep in touch and watch this space. Thank you in particular to Sam, Lowe, Julia, Magntorn, Garrett and Peter Holmes for speaking. And well, watch this space. There's still lots to play for. So thank you very much and have a good afternoon.